I need to start by telling you what my job actually looked like on a normal night, because none of what happened makes sense unless you understand how routine everything was up until the moment it wasn't. I worked for a regional gas station chain that ran about a dozen locations spread across 2 counties. Not a huge company, but big enough to have a real corporate structure above the individual stores, district managers, a compliance department, the whole thing. My store was mid-sized, 4 pumps, a decent-sized convenience section inside, 1 register up front, and a small back office with a safe bolted to the floor and a filing cabinet full of paperwork nobody ever really looked at unless something went wrong. Part of running a chain like that means dealing with compliance checks. Every few months, someone from the district office would come out and do a walkthrough. They'd check the expiration dates on the hot dogs turning on the roller grill, make sure the fire extinguisher tags were current, verify the safe logs matched what corporate system showed remotely. Nobody on staff particularly enjoyed these visits, but they were a normal part of the job, the kind of thing you stopped being nervous about after you'd been through a few of them. The visits were supposed to be unscheduled, at least in theory. Specifically so, a store couldn't clean up any issues in advance. That detail matters a lot to what happened later, so keep it in mind. It was a Tuesday night, a little after 9. Slow like most weeknights are once the dinner rush clears out. I was restocking the cigarette case behind the counter when the door chime went off and a man walked in wearing a gray polo shirt with our company logo stitched on the chest, exactly like the ones our actual district staff wore. And clipped to his belt was a laminated badge with a photo on it and some kind of employee ID number printed underneath. He introduced himself as Gary, said he was doing an unscheduled compliance walkthrough for the district office, apologized for the late hour, said corporate liked to catch some of these checks during evening hours now, since that's when a lot of the actual customer traffic and staffing challenges happen. All of that tracked with what I already knew about how these visits worked. I didn't think twice about any of it. He asked if he could take a look at the back office, specifically the safe logs and the deposit slip records. I told him sure, walked him back there myself, and left him to it while I went back up front to ring up a customer buying a pack of cigarettes and a lottery ticket. He was back there for a while. Long enough that I glanced at the clock more than once, wondering if I should check on him. But these audits could genuinely take 20 or 30 minutes depending on how thorough the person doing them wanted to be, and I didn't want to seem like I was hovering or making him feel rushed. Eventually he came out, thanked me, told me everything looked fine, said corporate would follow up directly with my manager if there were any issues found in the paperwork. Then he walked out to a dark sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, got in, and drove off. I didn't think about it again for 2 days. My manager, Priya, mentioned during a shift changeover that we had a compliance visit scheduled for later that week, something she'd gotten an email notification about from the district office that morning. I told her one had already happened a couple nights earlier. I described the man, described the shirt, the badge, all of it. She got a strange look on her face. She said that didn't make sense because compliance visits went through a scheduling system now, had for over a year, specifically so stores could staff appropriately and make sure a manager or a senior employee was present. Unscheduled walk-in audits weren't something the district office did anymore, and she said, more slowly this time, that she didn't recognize the name Gary from anyone on the compliance team, and she'd worked with most of them personally at one point or another over the years. I felt a small, uncomfortable twist in my stomach, but I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a different department doing some kind of internal franchise review I didn't know about. Maybe he was new, and Priya just hadn't met him yet. People come up with explanations like that because the alternative is uncomfortable to sit with, and I wanted an easy answer more than I wanted the true one. That easy answer didn't last long. 2 nights later, I went to close out the register at the end of my shift, same routine I'd done hundreds of times by that point, counting the drawer down to the dollar before locking it into the safe for the overnight pickup. It came up $60 short, not an amount that immediately screamed theft, small enough that it could plausibly be a counting mistake somewhere over the course of a busy shift. But I'd counted my starting drawer that morning myself, and I was careful, meticulous even, specifically because coming up short reflects on you as an employee and nobody wants that conversation with their manager. I recounted it twice, still $60 short. I went to log the discrepancy in the safe paperwork, the way we're trained to do whenever the numbers don't match, and that's when I noticed the deposit slips inside looked slightly off. Not obviously tampered with, nothing dramatic. Just the edges weren't lined up the way I always kept them, like someone had pulled the stack out, flipped through it, and put it back not quite as neatly as it had been before. I called Priya immediately, even though it was well past midnight by that point. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, then told me to pull the security footage covering the office for the night Gary had visited, just to be thorough, just to rule things out. I sat in that back office alone, scrubbing through the footage on our system, feeling more uneasy with every minute that passed. The camera covering the office door showed exactly what I remembered. Gary walking in at 9:11, walking back out at 9:31, 20 minutes, matching what I remembered. But the second camera, the one mounted inside the office, pointed directly down at the safe and the filing cabinet, had a gap in it. Not the whole visit missing, just an 11-minute chunk right in the middle, time-stamped normally on either side of the gap, but showing nothing but a black frozen frame during those specific 11 minutes. Our system had never done that before. I checked the days before and after. Perfectly normal footage the entire time, no gaps, no glitches, nothing unusual at all except for those 11 minutes. Priya called the district office first thing the next morning. I sat in on part of that call, and I remember the woman on the other end getting increasingly firm as the conversation went on. No one named Gary worked in their compliance department. No unscheduled visit had been logged or authorized for our store that week. As far as the company's official records were concerned, nobody from corporate had set foot in our store at all that night. "Can you describe him one more time?" the woman on the phone asked, and I could hear typing in the background, like she was searching something as we spoke. I gave her everything I could remember. Medium height, maybe a little on the thin side, brown hair kept short, glasses with thin metal frames, a voice that stayed level and pleasant the entire time, never once raised, never once impatient, even when I asked him a couple of basic questions about how long the visit would take. She told me none of that matched anyone currently or previously employed in that department, at least not according to what she could pull up on her screen. She asked if I still had the badge number, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I hadn't thought to write it down. I'd seen it clipped to his belt, glanced at it long enough to register that it looked legitimate, and never actually read the numbers themselves. That detail bothered me for weeks afterward, the fact that something as simple as writing down 6 digits might have been the difference between an answer and nothing at all. Priya asked the district office to pull any footage from nearby stores in case the same sedan had been spotted elsewhere. Nothing came back immediately, though she told me later that request had apparently been added to some kind of ongoing internal file, which made me wonder just how many other stores might have had a similar visitor without anyone connecting the dots yet. What unsettled me more than anything wasn't just that a stranger had walked into a locked back office and possibly walked out with money. It was how completely natural he'd been the whole time. He hadn't fumbled looking for the safe. He hadn't asked where the deposit paperwork was kept. He'd walked back there like he already knew the layout, like he'd been in that exact office before, more than once, enough times to move through it with total confidence in under 30 seconds of me pointing him in the general direction. We changed the safe combination that same day. Priya pulled old employment records going back 3 years, cross-referencing anyone who'd ever had legitimate access to that office, comparing photos where she could find them against my description of Gary's face, his build, the way he talked. A couple of names came close in a general sense. Similar height, similar age, but nothing lined up cleanly enough to say with any real confidence that we'd found him. About 5 weeks later, I heard through a coworker who'd transferred from another location that a nearly identical incident had happened at a store roughly 40 minutes away. Same story. Man in a gray polo, laminated badge, claiming to be conducting an unscheduled compliance check, spending close to 20 minutes alone in their back office. Their register came up short that same night by a similar amount. Their internal safe camera had the same kind of unexplained gap in the footage, right in the middle of his visit, timestamps intact on either side. Corporate finally sent out a company-wide notice after that second incident, informing every store manager that all compliance visits were strictly appointment, only going forward, and that any unscheduled visitor claiming to represent the company, regardless of how legitimate their badge or uniform looked, should be denied access to any secure area and reported to district management immediately. As far as I know, no further incidents were ever reported after that notice went out. Whether that meant whoever it was finally stopped, or simply moved on to targeting a different chain entirely, I have no idea. I still think about how unbothered he was the entire time, how he never once raised his voice or seemed rushed, how he thanked me on his way out like he genuinely just finished doing his job. I think about the confidence in the way he walked straight to that safe without a single moment of hesitation, like a man returning to a place he already knew intimately. And more than anything, I think about those 11 minutes that our system somehow never managed to record. Like whatever actually happened in that room during that stretch of time was never meant to exist anywhere except inside his memory, and mine, standing at that counter, letting a stranger walk straight through a door I should have thought twice about opening. Hiring for the overnight position was always the hardest part of managing that store, because most people don't want to work from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and the ones who apply for it tend to fall into two categories. Either they genuinely don't mind the hours, or they're desperate enough for any job that the schedule doesn't matter to them. I did the first round of interviews myself, since my manager trusted me to screen candidates before she made the final call on anyone we brought on full-time. A man named Corey applied within the first day the listing went up. His resume looked solid enough, previous retail experience, no obvious red flags, and when I called him in for an interview, he showed up exactly on time, dressed appropriately, answered every question clearly and without hesitation. If I'm being honest, he was one of the stronger candidates we saw that week. I told him at the end of the interview that we were still talking to a few other people and that we'd be in touch either way within the week, which was standard and which I meant sincerely. We ended up hiring a different candidate, a woman named Renata, who had several years of overnight retail experience already and impressed my manager during her interview even more than Corey had impressed me. That happens. Somebody has to lose out even when they did everything right, and it's never personal. It's just how hiring works when you only have one position open. I sent Corey a standard rejection message through our hiring platform, the same message we sent every candidate we didn't move forward with, thanking him for his time and encouraging him to apply again in the future if another position opened up. 3 nights later, close to midnight, Corey walked into the store. I recognized him right away from the interview, remembered his face clearly since I'd spent a solid 20 minutes across a table from him barely a week earlier. He walked up to the counter and asked, politely, if the overnight position was still open. I told him, as gently as I could, that we'd already filled it, that he should have received an email letting him know. He said he never got anything like that. I found this a little odd, since our system logs every message sent and marks whether or not it was successfully delivered. But I didn't want to argue with him about it, so I pulled up the record right there at the counter and turned the screen toward him. It showed the rejection message sent 3 days earlier, delivered successfully according to the system. He looked at the screen for a long moment. Something crossed his face that I couldn't quite place at the time, something between confusion and disappointment, and he thanked me quietly before turning and walking back out into the night. He came back the next night, almost the exact same time, close to midnight. He asked the same question nearly word for word, like our conversation from the night before had never happened at all. I reminded him, as patiently as I could manage, that the position had been filled, that I'd shown him the confirmation myself less than 24 hours earlier. He looked genuinely confused by this, insisted this was the first time he was asking, and left again without pushing the matter further. I mentioned it to my manager the next day during our shift overlap, and she suggested he was probably just disappointed and hoping the situation might somehow change if he kept trying. She said that happens sometimes with people who really need the work, that it wasn't necessarily anything to worry about beyond being a little repetitive and awkward. I wanted to believe that was all it was, so I let it go for the time being. He came back a third night. This time he didn't ask about the job at all. He walked directly to the coffee station near the back of the store, stood there for several minutes without pouring anything into a cup, and stared up at the security camera mounted above the main register. Not a passing glance the way most people do without thinking about it. A fixed, unmoving stare that lasted long enough to make the hair on my arms stand up, long enough that I found myself gripping the edge of the counter a little tighter than I needed to. Then, without buying anything or saying a single word to me, he turned and walked out. I started feeling genuinely unsettled after that visit, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel during the first two. I pulled his original job application back up and looked more closely at the details than I had during the initial screening process, when I'd mostly focused on his work history and references. The home address he'd listed didn't correspond to any actual residential building I could find through a basic search, no matching property records, nothing. The phone number, when I finally worked up the nerve to call it during a quiet stretch of my shift, rang through to an automated recording stating the number was no longer in service. I remember sitting in the back office with the application printed out on the desk in front of me, staring at that address like it might rearrange itself into something real if I looked at it long enough. It didn't. I even drove past the general area on my way home one morning after a shift, just to see for myself, and found a stretch of road with no house numbers anywhere close to the one he'd written down, just an empty lot with waist-high grass and a rusted mailbox that didn't belong to anyone as far as I could tell. I brought all of this to my manager, laying it out clearly. The address, the disconnected number, the repeated late-night visits, the staring at the camera. She agreed it was strange enough to escalate, and she looped in our district office for guidance, especially given that Corey had now been seen on our cameras 3 separate nights behaving in a way that was clearly moving past simple disappointment. They advised documenting every future visit in detail and calling the police non-emergency line if he came back again, purely as a precaution while we figured out what, if anything, was actually going on. Between the 3rd visit and the 4th, there was almost a full week where nothing happened at all, and I want to be honest about how strange that stretch of quiet felt. I kept expecting him every single night, kept glancing at the door every time the chime went off, kept finding myself relieved and unsettled in equal measure whenever it turned out to be an ordinary customer instead. My manager suggested maybe he'd simply moved on, found work somewhere else, and I wanted to believe that. I even started to relax a little by the 5th or 6th quiet night in a row. During that stretch, I did some digging of my own, the kind I probably shouldn't have bothered with but couldn't help myself. I searched his name along with the town listed on his application and found almost nothing. No social media presence, no public records, nothing beyond a single old forum post from years earlier that used a similar username and mentioned, in passing, having worked overnight retail somewhere out of state. I couldn't confirm it was even the same person. It just added another loose thread to a growing pile of things that didn't add up. I also asked Renata, the woman we'd hired instead of him, if she'd noticed anything odd during her own shifts, wondering if maybe he was showing up on nights other than mine as well. She said no, nothing at all, and seemed genuinely surprised when I explained what had been happening on my end. That detail bothered me more than I expected it to. If he really was still coming around, he was doing it specifically on my nights, not simply drifting in whenever the store happened to be open. He returned a 4th time, close to 2 in the morning, on a night I happened to be closing alone. This time he didn't come inside the store at all. He stood out in the parking lot, positioned right at the edge of where our camera's range started to blur into darkness, and stayed there for what my footage later confirmed was nearly a full hour. He'd occasionally take a few steps closer to the building, almost testing something, before drifting back to that same exact spot at the edge of the light, like he was carefully mapping out exactly how far our coverage extended and where it didn't. I called the police that night, hands shaking as I dialed, following the instructions I'd been given. By the time an officer actually arrived, maybe 15 minutes later, Corey was already gone, no sign of him anywhere in the lot or on the surrounding street. The officer reviewed our footage with me, asked several questions about the previous visits, took a copy of everything for their records, and told me that without an actual crime having taken place, there wasn't a tremendous amount more they could do at that stage, beyond keeping a closer, informal eye on the area during their regular patrols through the night. He never came back after the police visit. Not once, in all the months I continued working there afterward. I still don't fully understand what he actually wanted, whether it was ever truly about the job at all, or whether the job application had simply been his way of learning our store's layout, our schedule, our cameras. I don't know why the address and phone number on his original application led to nowhere real, or whether that was deliberate from the very beginning. What stays with me the most, more than any of the later, more obviously frightening visits, is that second night. The way he stood there, confused and completely sincere, insisting a conversation had never happened that I had watched take place with my own eyes less than a full day earlier, like something about that exchange had genuinely, somehow, never reached him at all. I asked my manager once, months after it was all over, whether she thought we'd made the right call hiring Renata instead of him. It felt like a strange question even as I asked it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some alternate version of that week where we'd offered him the job instead, where none of it would have happened at all, or where something far worse might have unfolded once he was the one holding a set of keys to that store. She didn't have an answer for me, and honestly, neither did I. Renata still works there, last I heard. She told me once that she sometimes thinks about him too, mostly late at night during the quiet stretches when nothing else is happening and there's nothing to do but watch the door and wait for the next car to pull in. She said she still checks the lot before unlocking up in the mornings, just to be sure. I don't blame her. I do the same thing at whatever job I'm working now, months and jobs removed from that store, glancing out at empty parking lots a little longer than I probably need to, waiting to see if someone's standing at the edge of the light. The station I worked at was old, older than most of the corporate-owned locations in our chain, built sometime back in the 1970s according to a set of yellowed permits still framed and hanging crookedly on the office wall, half forgotten behind a filing cabinet nobody ever moved. It had passed through a handful of different owners over the decades before the company I worked for finally took it over sometime in the early 2000s, and by the time I started working there, it had that particular worn-in feeling that only comes from a building that's been serving the same stretch of highway for longer than most of its employees had been alive. Sometime during my second year on the job, corporate decided it was finally time to replace the underground fuel tanks. Equipment that old needs replacing eventually, no matter how well it's been maintained, purely as a matter of safety regulations and liability. And I remember hearing about the decision weeks in advance during one of our monthly staff meetings. Nothing that seemed unusual or worth dwelling on at the time. Just routine infrastructure work, the kind of thing that happens at every gas station eventually. I wasn't scheduled to work the day the excavation crew showed up, which meant everything I know about what actually happened that morning, I know secondhand, first from my manager in the days immediately afterward, and later, in far more detail, from one of the crew members himself, a heavyset guy named Walt who ended up becoming a regular customer of mine for months after the incident, and who, over the course of several slow overnight conversations, told me pieces of the story that never made it into any official report I ever saw. The crew arrived early on a Monday morning, well before the store opened, and began digging out the old tank structure beneath what had always been labeled Pump 2, the second pump from the left as you pulled into the lot. According to Walt, the excavation went completely normally for the first couple of hours, standard removal work, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, while widening the excavation slightly to access a support line running beneath the tank, one of the operators struck something that clearly wasn't part of the tank structure at all. It was a section of poured concrete, positioned just beside where the tank had been resting for decades, and unlike the surrounding material, this section was noticeably newer. The composition slightly different. Enough that even someone without specialized training could tell at a glance that it hadn't been part of the original 1970s construction. It was sealing off some kind of space beneath the surface, roughly the size of a small room according to Walt's estimate, positioned close enough to the original tank that it must have been dug and poured sometime after the station's initial construction, though how long after, nobody could say with any certainty just from looking at it. Walt described the moment vividly, the operator backing the machine off slowly, calling the foreman over, the two of them crouching at the edge of the excavation for a long minute without saying much of anything, just staring down at that unmistakably newer patch of concrete sitting where it had no business being. Work stopped immediately once the crew foreman realized what they were looking at. My manager, Denise, was called out to the site within the hour, and not long after that, the police were called as well, since there was no record anywhere in the store's paperwork, no blueprint, no permit, nothing at all referencing any kind of underground structure beyond the tank itself. Whatever this was, it had been built without documentation, deliberately hidden beneath a functioning, actively used gas station for what appeared to be a significant length of time. It took the better part of that entire day to safely and properly open the space once investigators arrived and took over from the construction crew. Walt wasn't allowed anywhere near it once the police secured the scene, and everything he told me after that point came from what he'd overheard from officers standing around during the long hours the crew was told to wait nearby in case additional excavation was needed to fully access whatever had been found. According to what he pieced together, inside the sealed space they found the remains of what appeared to have once been some kind of makeshift living area. Old bedding, long since decayed and unrecognizable as anything specific beyond fabric and stuffing gone to rot. A scattering of small personal items that investigators photographed extensively before removing. And markings, scratched directly into the concrete walls in several places, which investigators later confirmed, through whatever forensic process they used, had been made from the inside of the space, not the outside, meaning whoever had left those marks had done so while already sealed in, not before the space was closed off. The property had changed ownership at least 3 separate times over the decades since its original construction, based on records Denise later pulled while trying to help investigators piece together a timeline, and none of the previous owners on file had any documentation whatsoever referencing that hidden space, no permits, no construction records, nothing explaining who had built it or for what purpose. I didn't work at the store during any of this, since I happened to be off that entire week for reasons that had nothing to do with any of it, pure coincidence and timing that I've thought about more than I probably should. I came back the following Monday to a store that felt fundamentally different, even though almost nothing about its visible, physical structure had actually changed on the surface. Corporate had authorized a temporary closure while the investigation continued, and when the station finally reopened, Pump 2 had simply been removed entirely, never replaced, leaving a strange, oddly proportioned gap in the pump island that customers asked me about constantly during those first few months, never quite satisfied by whatever vague answer I gave them. I asked Denise directly, more than once, exactly what had been found down there beyond the general outline that seemed to already be common knowledge among the staff. She always gave me the same careful, practiced non-answer, that it wasn't something she was permitted to discuss in detail, given that it remained technically part of an open investigation even years later, longer than I ultimately ended up working there myself. Walt, the crew member, was considerably less careful about what he shared with me over time. Maybe because enough distance had passed that the whole thing felt more like an old, half-forgotten story to him than something still actively unresolved. He told me, one slow night while filling up his truck and lingering at the counter longer than usual, that the scratches on the wall hadn't been random. From what he'd overheard investigators discussing on site while he waited around with the rest of the crew, the marks appeared to follow some kind of counting system. Evenly spaced groupings scratched into the concrete, the unmistakable pattern of someone tracking the passage of days, the only way available to them in a space with no calendar and no way of knowing what was happening outside. He told me the groupings, based on rough estimates investigators had discussed among themselves, suggested whoever had made them survived down there for a significant stretch of time, likely weeks at minimum, possibly longer, before the marks simply stopped appearing altogether. Nobody, Walt overheard, seemed to know, or was willing to say out loud, whether that stopping point meant the person had eventually been released, had somehow escaped on their own, or had met a far darker end sealed in that space with no way out. Denise told me once, in a rare unguarded moment near the end of a long shift, that investigators had asked her to pull every employment record the store had on file, going back as far as our system allowed, cross-referencing names against old missing persons reports from the surrounding counties. She said she'd spent the better part of 2 full days doing nothing but scanning old timesheets and half-legible handwritten schedules from years before either of us worked there, looking for any name that might connect to someone who'd simply stopped showing up one day without explanation. She never told me whether anything came of it, and I never had the nerve to ask her a second time. I also remember a woman who came into the store maybe 2 months after it reopened, older, soft-spoken, who stood at the counter for a long moment before finally asking if I knew anything about what they found. I told her honestly that I didn't know much beyond what everyone already seemed to know. She nodded slowly, thanked me, and told me her daughter had gone missing from a town about 40 minutes away, sometime back in the early 90s, and that she'd been driving out to places like this one for years, any place a news story mentioned even in passing, just to ask. I didn't know what to say to her. I still don't. I worked at that station for another full year after all of this happened, and I don't think a single overnight shift went by where I didn't glance at that permanently empty gap in the pump island at some point. That space where Pump 2 used to sit, plainly visible to every single customer who pulled into the lot, most of whom had no idea what had once been found directly beneath their feet while they waited to fill up their tank. A few longtime regulars asked about it constantly, wondering why it was never replaced, never rebuilt, simply left as an empty gap in an otherwise ordinary pump island. I always gave some version of the same careful, incomplete answer Denise had given me, mentioning maintenance issues or ongoing repairs, never quite able to bring myself to tell them the full truth of what I actually knew. Walt stopped coming by regularly after a while, the way regulars sometimes just drift off to other routes or other jobs without any real goodbye, and I lost the closest thing I had to an ongoing source of information about where the investigation eventually went. I looked, occasionally, in the years since, searching old local news archives whenever I thought to, hoping something might have surfaced publicly that would finally give the story an ending. I never found anything conclusive. A couple of brief, vague articles from around the time it happened, mentioning an ongoing investigation into a discovery, without any real detail, and then nothing after that, like the story simply stopped being followed once it stopped being new. I think about it still, more than I probably should for a job I haven't worked in years now. I think about those evenly spaced groupings scratched into concrete by someone whose name nobody ever seemed to learn, tracking days they had no other way of counting, in a space built and sealed directly beneath a gas station that thousands of ordinary people drove past every single week without a single one of them ever suspecting what was resting quietly in the ground beneath their tires. I was working an isolated station out near the mountains, the kind of location that only really made sense because it sat along one specific stretch of highway with nothing else around for a long distance in either direction. A serious storm rolled in one night during my closing shift, heavy enough that the highway patrol had already started advising against unnecessary travel through that stretch, according to the radio I kept on quietly behind the counter. A man came stumbling in around midnight, soaked completely through, saying his car had slid off the road somewhere back down the mountain and that his phone had died before he could call for help. He asked to use our landline to reach a tow service and asked if he could wait inside until someone could come get him, given the storm outside. It seemed like a completely reasonable request given the weather, and I let him in without much hesitation, brought him a towel from the back, and let him use the phone while I went back to my closing routine. He made a call, spoke briefly, and told me a tow truck was on its way, but would likely take at least an hour given how many other calls they were probably getting that night. I didn't think much of it until I noticed, glancing at the exterior camera feed while restocking a shelf, that there wasn't actually a car visible anywhere near our lot, not stranded on the shoulder, not anywhere within the range of our cameras at all, despite him claiming his had slid off the road nearby just before walking in. I asked him casually where exactly his car had gone off the road, trying to sound like simple small talk rather than suspicion. He gave an answer that was vague, gesturing generally back down the mountain without a specific landmark, which could have been completely innocent given how disoriented someone might reasonably be after an accident in a storm like that. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me, and I quietly moved toward the counter where our emergency contact list and silent alarm button were kept, trying to stay calm and not tip him off that anything felt wrong. He noticed anyway, watching me a little too closely as I moved, and asked, in a tone that had shifted slightly from earlier, why I seemed nervous all of a sudden. I told him I wasn't, that I was just finishing my closing tasks, and tried to keep my voice steady while quietly pressing the silent alarm button positioned just under the counter, the same one wired directly to local dispatch for exactly this kind of situation. He stayed for another 20 minutes or so, the conversation growing increasingly strange, him asking oddly specific questions about whether I worked alone every night, what time I usually locked up, whether the store had cameras covering every angle, or if there were blind spots he might have already noticed on his way in. A patrol car finally pulled into the lot, lights on but not sirens, exactly the kind of quiet response dispatch uses when responding to a silent alarm without wanting to immediately escalate a situation before assessing it. The man's entire demeanor changed the moment he saw it, and he left the store abruptly on foot, heading directly into the storm rather than waiting for whatever tow truck he'd supposedly called. The officers who responded told me, after briefly searching the area, that there was no evidence of any crashed vehicle anywhere along that stretch of highway consistent with his story. No debris, no tire marks leaving the road, nothing at all suggesting an accident had actually occurred that night. They also told me, more seriously, that a man matching his general description had been reported in connection with an incident at a different isolated location roughly 2 weeks earlier, though they couldn't share full details with me directly. He was never caught that night disappearing into the storm and the surrounding wilderness before officers could locate him. I was moved to a different, less isolated location shortly afterward, at my own request, and I've never taken another closing shift alone at a station without proper backup or a reliable way to call for help since. I still think about how ordinary his story sounded walking through that door. How easy it would have been to simply believe every word of it without ever glancing at that empty stretch of highway on the camera feed behind me. I picked up a lot of overnight shifts covering for other employees, which meant my schedule changed fairly often week to week, never posted publicly anywhere beyond an internal scheduling app only staff could access. That detail matters a lot to what happened next. A man started coming into the store consistently, always on nights I was working, never on nights I wasn't. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Maybe he just happened to prefer the overnight hours generally, and our schedules lined up by chance. But over the following month, the pattern became too precise to reasonably explain that way. Even when I picked up a last-minute shift with barely a day's notice, replacing someone who'd called in sick, he'd show up that same night without fail. He never did anything overtly threatening. He'd buy something small, make brief small talk, comment on things that seemed harmless on the surface, mentioning the weather, asking how my night was going. But the comments slowly became more specific in a way that started to genuinely unsettle me. He referenced a coffee shop by name that I frequented on my days off, one I never discussed with customers. He asked, once, in a casual tone, how my drive home along a specific street was going lately, a street I did in fact take regularly, though I had absolutely no memory of ever telling him that. I started documenting every visit carefully, dates, times, exactly what he said, and brought the pattern to my manager, who agreed it sounded concerning enough to involve the district office and eventually local police, given the specificity of what he seemed to know about my personal routine outside of work entirely. An officer suggested he might be following me directly rather than simply visiting on nights he somehow guessed I'd be working, which meant the store visits themselves might just be one small visible piece of a much larger pattern of surveillance I hadn't otherwise noticed. I started varying my route home, parking in different spots, being more careful about what I discussed even quietly with coworkers while on shift, in case he was somehow overhearing things I assumed were private. The visits continued regardless of these changes, still landing precisely on my working nights no matter how unpredictable my schedule became. The situation escalated on a night he stayed unusually long, lingering near the coffee station far past any reasonable amount of time for the small purchase he eventually made. Right before leaving, he said something that has stuck with me every single day since. He said, casually, like commenting on the weather one more time, "You've got the closing shift again on Thursday, right? I'll probably swing by." Thursday wasn't posted publicly anywhere at that point. I hadn't even confirmed it with my manager yet myself, since the schedule for that specific week hadn't been finalized within the internal system, meaning even I didn't fully know my own Thursday assignment with certainty at the moment he said it. Police increased patrols near the store after that specific comment was reported, and I was moved to a different location entirely for my own safety while the situation was investigated further. I never learned the outcome of that investigation in full detail, only that he was eventually identified and questioned, though I was told there wasn't enough concrete evidence at that time to pursue formal charges beyond an official warning. I still don't know how he consistently knew my schedule days before I sometimes knew it myself. I've changed jobs twice since then, and I still find myself checking who's standing behind me in line every single time I'm anywhere alone after dark. I worked at a truck stop style gas station off a major interstate, big enough to have a dedicated restroom hallway separate from the main store, the kind of setup where truckers could come in, use the facilities, grab a shower if they'd paid for one, and be back on the road within 20 minutes. I didn't think much about that hallway beyond making sure it stayed clean and stocked. I started noticing small pieces of folded paper tucked behind the paper towel dispenser during my restocking rounds, always tucked in the exact same spot, never anywhere else. The first one I found had a short string of numbers and letters on it, nothing that made obvious sense to me, and I assumed it was just trash, maybe a receipt someone had shoved back there by accident. I threw it away without thinking twice. A similar note appeared the next week. Different combination of characters, same exact hiding spot. I started keeping them instead of throwing them away, mostly out of curiosity, since the pattern of always being placed in that one precise location felt too deliberate to be random litter. I mentioned it to a trucker who came through regularly enough that we become friendly over time. He got noticeably quiet when I described it, then told me something that made my stomach turn. He said truck stop restrooms, particularly ones near major interstates, were sometimes used as informal message drops for people involved in things far more serious than they appeared on the surface, sometimes tied to trafficking networks using coded notes to communicate pickup times, locations, or which vehicles to look for, precisely because a busy restroom sees so much anonymous foot traffic that a hidden note can pass along critical information without anyone needing to speak a single word to each other. I didn't want to believe that was actually happening at my store, somewhere I'd worked for over a year without noticing anything overtly wrong. But once he said it, I couldn't stop noticing small details I'd previously ignored. Certain vehicles that came through at oddly specific, consistent times without ever actually buying fuel. A few customers over the months who'd used that restroom hallway and never once appeared on our main store cameras buying anything at all, despite clearly having driven into the lot and parked. I started documenting everything quietly, times, note contents, any vehicle descriptions I could remember, and eventually brought all of it to my manager, who took it seriously enough to loop in corporate security along with local law enforcement. An investigator came out and asked extensive questions, took photographs of the hiding spot, and asked me to continue my normal routine without changing anything, simply reporting back whenever a new note appeared instead of removing it right away like I'd been doing. Over the following month, working closely with that investigator, several notes were photographed and left in place rather than thrown away, and law enforcement eventually connected the pattern to an active investigation already underway involving a trafficking operation using several truck stops along that same interstate corridor as coordination points. I was told, carefully and without much detail beyond what I needed to know, that the investigation led to several arrests, though I was never given the full scope of what those arrests actually involved. I did later hear, informally and unofficially, that at least one recovered individual connected to the case had been transported through our specific location at some point during the months I'd been quietly collecting those folded notes without fully understanding what I was looking at. I think about how close I came to simply throwing every single one of those notes away without a second thought, exactly like I did the very first time, and how something that seemed like meaningless trash tucked behind a paper towel dispenser turned out to be one small piece of something far larger and far darker, moving quietly through a hallway I walked down dozens of times every single shift. Corporate rolled out a new customer service system to a handful of test stores, mine included, that used a small earpiece connected to a central support line, supposedly to help overnight clerks handle unusual situations without needing to leave the register to make a phone call. The idea was simple. If something happened, a suspicious customer, a question about a transaction, anything, you could quietly get guidance through the earpiece without the person in front of you knowing you were talking to anyone at all. I was skeptical at first, but it genuinely helped during my first few shifts using it. A calm voice on the other end walked me through a coupon issue I wasn't sure how to process, then later helped me handle a customer trying to return an item without a receipt. It felt efficient. Corporate seemed proud of the program during a brief training call, describing it as the future of overnight support. About 2 weeks in, the voice started saying things that had nothing to do with customer service. It started small. During a completely quiet moment with no customers in the store, the voice said, calm as ever, "Someone is standing behind the chip display." I looked. Nobody was there. I dismissed it as some kind of glitch, maybe a leftover automated prompt from an earlier part of a script that hadn't been cleared properly. A few nights later, during another quiet stretch, it said, "Check the door. It's not locked." I'd locked that door myself less than an hour earlier as part of my usual closing routine for that section of the store, well before regular closing time since that particular entrance wasn't meant to be used after a certain hour. I checked anyway. It was unlocked, the deadbolt sitting in the open position despite me being completely certain I'd secured it myself. I brought this up with my manager, who told me to just report technical issues through the normal channel and not worry too much about it, since the whole system was still technically in a trial phase and probably had bugs that needed working out. That answer didn't sit right with me, but I didn't have much else to go on at the time. The real turning point came on a night close to 3 in the morning, store completely empty, when the voice said something that had nothing to do with any script I could imagine a legitimate company writing. It said, "Quiet and even, you should turn around now." I did, more out of instinct than deliberate decision, and saw absolutely nothing behind me except the usual dim shelving and the closed door to the back office. I asked out loud who was actually speaking to me, since the voice hadn't identified itself with the usual scripted greeting used at the start of every shift like it normally did. There was a long pause, then the voice, in the exact same calm and pleasant tone it always used, said, "I'm just here to help," and then the line went completely silent, the earpiece emitting nothing at all for the remainder of my shift, not even the usual faint hold static it normally had running in the background. I reported the entire incident formally the next morning, including as much detail as I could remember. Corporate pulled the entire earpiece program from all test stores within a week, citing what they called unresolved technical inconsistencies, without offering much further explanation to the staff who'd been using it. I asked, informally, through a friend who worked in a different department, whether the support line's call logs from that specific night had shown anything unusual. She told me, hesitantly, that according to the system records, no call had been connected to my earpiece at all during that entire overnight shift, meaning whatever voice had been speaking to me the whole night, guiding me through customer issues and eventually telling me to turn around, had not come through the company's system in any way they could account for.